The morning light filtered through the blinds of Olivia Harmon's apartment in Queens, casting long shadows across faded photographs that hadn't been moved in years. Outside, New York had transformed countless times since 1992. Neighborhoods gentrified, skylines altered, faces changed. But inside this small one-bedroom apartment, time stood eerily still, preserved like a museum to what once was. 32 years. That's how long it had been since Olivia's 19-year-old daughter, Caitlin, walked into a convenience store on Steinway Street and never walked out. Olivia, now 73, her once auburn hair faded to steel grey, ran her weathered fingers across the kitchen counter as she prepared her morning tea. The routine never changed. Earl Grey, 1 sugar cube, the blue mug with the chip on the handle, the mug Caitlin had given her for Mother's Day, just 3 weeks before she vanished. "Another year," Olivia whispered to the empty apartment. May 17th, the anniversary, the day the world stopped making sense. She settled into her worn armchair by the window, the same one she'd been sitting in when 2 officers knocked on her door all those years ago. Their faces blurred in her memory now, but their words remained crystal clear. "Your daughter hasn't returned home. Her roommate reported her missing." The investigation had started hopefully enough. Security footage showed Caitlin entering the convenience store at 7:42 p.m. She wore a NYU sweatshirt, jeans, and carried a small backpack. The detective said she purchased a bottle of water and a magazine. Then she exited the store at 7:46 p.m., turned left, and walked out of frame and out of existence. No cameras picked her up after that. No witnesses remembered seeing her. Her bank account remained untouched. Her half-eaten dinner was still on the table in her apartment. Her toothbrush remained in its holder. It was as if she'd simply evaporated between one moment and the next. Olivia took a slow sip of tea, wincing slightly at the temperature. Back then, she'd been so certain they'd find her daughter. People didn't just disappear in New York, not without leaving traces. But as days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, hope began to wither like flowers on an untended grave. The investigation stalled. Other cases took priority. Detective Reeves, the lead investigator, had been kind but ultimately helpless. "We've exhausted all leads," he told her after the 1-year mark. "But the case remains open. We'll contact you if anything changes." Nothing ever changed. For years, Olivia plastered the city with missing person flyers. She appeared on local news programs. She hired private investigators who took her money and returned with nothing but sympathetic glances. She joined support groups for families of the missing, finding both comfort and dread in their shared experiences. Some families eventually found closure. Others, like Olivia, learned to live with the constant, gnawing uncertainty. Now, as another anniversary dawned, Olivia performed her ritual. She opened the cedar box on the coffee table, Caitlin's jewelry box, and carefully removed its contents. A silver locket with a picture of them together inside, a bracelet with a dolphin charm Caitlin had loved since childhood, and a small notebook filled with her daughter's handwriting. She held the notebook, caressing its worn cover. Caitlin had used it to jot down ideas for her photography assignments at NYU. Her dream had been to become a photojournalist. "I want to tell stories that matter," she'd told Olivia countless times. Olivia hadn't opened the notebook in years. It hurt too much to see her daughter's handwriting, to feel the abrupt halt of a life barely begun. But today, something compelled her to flip through the pages. Familiar sketches, notes about lighting and composition, lists of places in the city she wanted to photograph. And then, on the last page, something strange, something Olivia had somehow never noticed before. A name and address written hastily, the pen having pressed hard enough to leave an impression on several pages beneath. Marcus Whitaker, 1408 Riverside Drive, followed by a single line, "Meet 8 p.m., bringing evidence." Olivia's hand trembled. The tea mug slipped from her grasp and shattered on the hardwood floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. But she barely noticed. May 17th, 1992. Caitlin disappeared at 7:46 p.m. On her way to this meeting, bringing evidence of what? For the first time in many years, Olivia felt something stir within her chest. Not hope. She'd learned long ago how dangerous hope could be, but something adjacent to it. A quickening of her pulse, a sudden alertness, as if she'd been sleepwalking for decades and had finally suddenly awakened. She reached for her phone with unsteady fingers. Detective Reeves had retired years ago, but his replacement, Detective Diana Mercer, still called every year around this time. A courtesy check-in that had become perfunctory, expected to yield nothing new. But this year would be different. Olivia knew it with a certainty that took her breath away. "Hello, Detective Mercer, it's Olivia Harmon." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, stronger, more focused than it had been in years. "I need to see you immediately. I've found something about Caitlin's disappearance, something important." Outside, New York continued its relentless forward motion, but in a small apartment in Queens, the past had suddenly, violently returned to life. Detective Diana Mercer had seen her share of cold cases in 15 years with the NYPD, but something about Caitlin Harmon's disappearance had always lingered in her mind like an unsolved equation. Perhaps it was the complete lack of evidence, or the way the girl had vanished so thoroughly in one of the most surveilled cities in the world. Or perhaps it was the quiet dignity of Olivia Harmon, who never stopped believing that someday someone would find the answer. When Olivia called that morning, there was an urgency in her voice that Mercer hadn't heard before. She cleared her schedule and drove to Queens. Olivia's hands shook as she handed over the notebook. "All these years, I never noticed this last entry. How could I have missed it?" Mercer studied the faded writing. "Marcus Whitaker, 1408 Riverside Drive, meeting at 8 p.m., bringing evidence." "Do you recognize this name?" Mercer asked. "Was he a friend? A classmate, maybe?" Olivia shook her head. "I've never heard of him, but Caitlin was passionate about photography. She was always meeting new people for projects." Mercer made a note. "The address on Riverside, that building still exists. It's been renovated into luxury condominiums, but it was apartments back then too." She looked up at Olivia. "I'll run this name through our databases. If he has any history in the system, we'll find it." "Do you think—" Olivia stopped herself, as if afraid to voice the thought. "I don't want to give you false hope," Mercer said gently, "but this is the first new lead in a very long time. I'm going to pursue it." Back at the precinct, Mercer began digging. Marcus Whitaker was a common enough name. Initially, she found 17 in the greater New York area during that time period. She cross-referenced them with residence records, narrowing it down to 3 who had lived near Riverside Drive in the early 1990s. The first was an elderly man who had died in 1998. The second was a 12-year-old boy at the time of Caitlin's disappearance, clearly not their suspect. The third made Mercer sit up straight in her chair. Marcus Whitaker, born 1958, had lived at 1408 Riverside Drive, apartment 5C, from 1989 to 1993. He'd worked as a darkroom technician at several photography studios around the city, including one near NYU where photography students often developed their work. He had no criminal record in New York, but when Mercer expanded her search nationally, something troubling emerged. In 1993, just months after Caitlin's disappearance, Whitaker had moved to Seattle. And in 2001, he'd been investigated, though never charged, in connection with the disappearance of a young photography assistant there. The case went cold, just like Caitlin's. By 2003, Whitaker had moved again, this time to Chicago. His employment records showed he'd worked at a commercial photography studio there until 2010, when he seemingly dropped off the grid. Mercer picked up her phone and called her contact at the FBI. "I need everything you have on a Marcus Whitaker, Doe B 1122, 1958, particularly anything connected to missing persons cases in Seattle around 2001. 3 hours later, Mercer sat in a conference room surrounded by files. The Seattle case was disturbingly similar. A 22-year-old woman who worked with Whitaker had gone missing after telling friends she was meeting him to discuss some concerning photographs she'd found. She was never seen again, but the Seattle detective had been thorough. Although they couldn't prove Whitaker's involvement, they'd maintained surveillance on him for months. They noted his frequent moves, his pattern of changing jobs at photography studios, and his apparent interest in young female photographers. Most importantly, they'd photographed him discreetly depositing items in a storage facility outside the city. When they eventually obtained a warrant, the unit was empty. Whitaker had cleared it out. But the detective noted a suspicious chemical smell and traces of what might have been photographic development equipment. Mercer felt a chill run down her spine as she turned to the last page of the Seattle file. There was a note: subject relocated to Chicago, March 2003. Alert sent to CPD. See attached photo for identification. She stared at the grainy surveillance image of Marcus Whitaker, a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and intense eyes. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, though Mercer couldn't place it. She picked up her phone again. I need current location information on Marcus Whitaker, she told her FBI contact. And I need to know if there's any pattern of missing persons cases that might follow his movements. The call came back faster than she expected. Whitaker died in 2014, her contact said. Pancreatic cancer. But here's where it gets interesting. After his death, Chicago PD found evidence in his apartment linking him to at least 3 disappearances of young women between 1986 and 2010, all with connections to photography studios where he worked. And Caitlin Harmon? No direct evidence connecting him to her case, but the timeline and his location match. And there's something else. Whitaker kept detailed journals. Most were photography-related, but some entries suggest he had a collection. Photographs he shouldn't have had, images that were never published, taken by photographers who disappeared. He was stealing their work? Possibly. Or, her contact hesitated. The theory in Chicago was that he might have been stealing more than their photographs, that he was obsessed with possessing both the images and the photographers themselves. Mercer thanked her contact and hung up. She sat motionless for several minutes, processing what she'd learned. Then she picked up Caitlin's notebook again, studying the hasty scrawl, bringing evidence. What had Caitlin discovered, and what had happened when she met Whitaker that night? Mercer made one more call, to the evidence warehouse. I need all physical evidence from the Caitlin Harmon disappearance, 1992. Specifically, I'm looking for any undeveloped film or photographs. The next morning, Mercer sat with an evidence technician as they carefully examined the contents of Caitlin's backpack, the one she'd left in her apartment the day she disappeared. Inside was her camera, with a roll of film still inside. It had been logged but never developed, as the investigators at the time had focused on more recent photographs on her desk. Can we still develop this? Mercer asked. It's old, but possible, the technician said. It might be degraded, but we can try. 3 hours later, Mercer held a set of prints in her gloved hands. Most were student work, architecture shots, street scenes, portraits, but the last 4 images made her breath catch. They were photographs of a dark room, empty at first glance, but in the corner of one image, partially visible, was a shelf lined with notebooks, identical to the kind Caitlin had used. Dozens of them, each with a name and date neatly labeled on the spine. And in the final photograph, clearly visible despite the dim red lighting, was a tall figure entering the dark room. His face turned away from the camera, but his profile unmistakable from the surveillance photos. Marcus Whitaker. Caitlin had discovered something in that dark room, something that had compelled her to arrange a meeting, to bring evidence, something that had likely cost her her life. Mercer picked up her phone once more. Olivia? It's Detective Mercer. I need to see you immediately. We've found something about Caitlin's case, something important. Olivia's apartment had never felt smaller than it did with Detective Mercer sitting across from her, carefully laying out photographs on the coffee table. Each image seemed to throb with meaning, with revelations that had remained hidden for over 3 decades. These were in Caitlin's camera, Mercer explained gently. The roll was never developed during the original investigation. Olivia's hands trembled as she reached for the photos. Her daughter had been the last person to touch this film, to see these images through her viewfinder. It was like receiving a message across an impossible divide. "This man," Mercer continued, placing another photo on the table, a surveillance image of a gaunt-faced man with hollow eyes. "This is Marcus Whitaker. He worked as a darkroom technician at several photography studios around the city, including the one at NYU, where Caitlin developed her work." Olivia stared at the man's face, searching for some recognition, some connection that would explain why her daughter had written his name in her notebook, but he remained a stranger. "What did he do to my daughter?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mercer took a deep breath. After Caitlin's disappearance, Whitaker moved to Seattle, then to Chicago. In both cities, young female photographers went missing. He was investigated but never charged, until after his death in 2014, when evidence in his Chicago apartment connected him to multiple disappearances. He's dead? Something collapsed inside Olivia, some final, desperate hope for confrontation, for answers directly from the source. Yes, but what we've discovered suggests that Caitlin may have uncovered evidence of his earlier crimes. Mercer pointed to the darkroom photographs. "See these notebooks on the shelf? We believe Whitaker was collecting the work of photographers who disappeared, possibly stealing their images, their ideas." "That's what Caitlin meant by evidence," Olivia whispered. "She found something in his darkroom." Mercer nodded. "We think so. And we believe she arranged to meet him that night to confront him with what she'd discovered. But why would she go alone? Why not take this to the police?" Olivia's voice cracked. "She was 19, Mercer said gently. "Young, idealistic, perhaps overconfident. She might have wanted more proof before making accusations against someone in her academic community." Olivia closed her eyes, picturing her daughter, brave, determined Caitlin, who wanted to tell stories that mattered, who walked into danger believing she could make a difference. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "We've reopened the case as a homicide investigation. We've obtained warrants for all of Whitaker's known residences and storage facilities. Most importantly, we're working with the FBI to identify all possible victims and provide closure to their families. And Caitlin? Will we ever find—" Olivia couldn't finish the question. Mercer's expression softened. "I can't promise that, but we're going to do everything possible. Whitaker kept detailed records, journals, photographs. If there's anything that can lead us to Caitlin, we'll find it." 2 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, interviews, and unbearable waiting. Olivia alternated between frantic hope and numbing despair. Part of her wanted answers at any cost. Another part feared what those answers might reveal. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Detective Mercer arrived with a woman Olivia didn't recognize, a tall, composed woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Olivia, this is Special Agent Lauren Torres with the FBI's Violent Crimes Unit. She's been coordinating the multi-state investigation into Whitaker's cases." Agent Torres sat down carefully, maintaining respectful eye contact. "Mrs. Amon, we've made significant progress in understanding what happened to your daughter and the other victims. I wanted to personally update you on what we've learned." She opened a folder and withdrew several photographs, not crime scene photos, but portraits, young women all with similar features, intelligent eyes, thoughtful expressions, creative souls captured in film. "We've identified 8 victims over a 25-year period, including Caitlin," Torres explained. "All were photographers or photography students. All disappeared under similar circumstances after apparently discovering something about Whitaker's activities." "What was he doing?" Olivia asked. Torres hesitated. "Whitaker was deeply disturbed. He believed he could capture the essence of talented photographers by possessing their work and their final images. His journals reveal an obsession with what he called preserving their vision." Olivia felt sick. "Did he—" "We believe the victims were held captive for a period of time," Torres said carefully, forced to continue their work under his supervision. When they refused or tried to escape, he ensured they couldn't leave him. The room seemed to tilt. Olivia gripped the armrest of her chair, steadying herself. "There's something else," Torres continued after a moment. "Something we found in a storage facility in New Jersey that Whitaker maintained under a false name. Something I believe you should see." She withdrew a final photograph from her folder, not a victim this time, but an image of a wall, a gallery wall, covered in framed photographs, beautiful, haunting images of city streets, abandoned buildings, faces caught in moments of unguarded emotion. At the bottom of each frame was a small plaque with a name and date. Olivia's eyes found her daughter's name immediately. Caitlin Harmon, 1992, 1993. 1993? Olivia's voice cracked. She was alive after she disappeared? Torres nodded solemnly. Based on Whitaker's journals and this exhibition he created for himself, we believe Caitlin was alive for approximately 8 months after her disappearance. During that time, he forced her to continue photographing. These are her images. Olivia stared at the photograph, at the tiny glimpses of her daughter's work. Even in this terrible context, Caitlin's talent was evident. Her eye for composition, for finding beauty and truth in unexpected places. "We've recovered all the original prints and negatives," Torres said softly. "When this is over, they'll be returned to you. Her work, her vision, it belongs with you." Tears blurred Olivia's vision. After 3 decades of uncertainty, of imagining countless terrible scenarios, the truth was finally emerging. Not a comforting truth. There was no comfort to be found here, but a truth nonetheless. "What happened to her?" Olivia asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Whitaker's journals indicate that Caitlin never stopped trying to escape, to expose him. She was stronger than he expected. Torres's voice held a note of respect. In the end, when he realized he couldn't control her, he made a decision that ended her resistance. Olivia nodded, unable to speak. The details weren't necessary. She understood enough. "There's one more thing," Torres said after a respectful silence. She withdrew a small evidence bag containing a tarnished silver charm bracelet with a dolphin pendant. "This was found with her personal effects. We believe she kept it hidden from him, as a connection to you and her life before." Olivia reached for the bracelet with trembling hands, recognizing it instantly. The bracelet she'd given Caitlin on her 16th birthday. The one that had been in the jewelry box all these years was a replica, part of a set of 2 they had shared. For the first time since Mercer had arrived with the developed film, Olivia broke down completely, clutching the bracelet to her chest as decades of uncertainty crashed into the shore of unbearable certainty. Later that evening, after the detectives had gone, Olivia sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the newly developed photographs of her daughter's work. Images Caitlin had created even in captivity, even in her darkest hours. Beautiful, defiant images that proved her spirit had remained unbroken. In one photograph, perhaps the last Caitlin had ever taken, sunlight streamed through a narrow window, illuminating dust particles in the air. The composition was simple but perfect, light fighting through darkness, creating something beautiful in the most confined space. Outside, rain fell on New York City, washing the streets clean. Inside, Olivia finally began to weep for her daughter. Not the tears of uncertainty she'd shed for 30 years, but tears of grief, of knowledge, of terrible clarity. The truth had finally emerged. Not the truth she'd hoped for through decades of waiting, but the truth nonetheless. And in that truth, painful as it was, Olivia found what she had sought for 30 years. The end of wondering, the beginning of mourning, the possibility someday of peace. She placed the dolphin charm bracelet around her wrist, feeling its familiar weight. "I found you, Caitlin," she whispered to the empty room, to the photographs, to the daughter who would never come home. "I never stopped looking, and now I know your story. I'll make sure the world knows it too." One by one, she began to arrange the photographs on her wall, a gallery of her daughter's vision, her talent, her unquenchable spirit, a testament to a life that, even in darkness, had created light. If you're still with me after this emotional journey, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Look at the screen now. There's another video appearing that I think you'll find just as moving. Until next time, remember that even the darkest truths can bring a kind of peace, and no one is truly gone as long as their story continues to be told.